Hello and welcome to some more psychology revision. I'm Will Carne, this is Wahi Productions, and we are doing Social Influence, the much awaited series that took 2 years to make. That's right, you're welcome. Today is part 2 and we're doing all things obedience. Let's start with the definition. Obedience is behaving as instructed, usually in response to an individual rather than group pressure. This usually takes place in a hierarchy where the person issuing the order is of a higher status than the person obeying the order. Obedience occurs because an individual feels they have little choice, they cannot resist to obey, and it's unlikely to involve change in private opinion. There are lots of differences between conformity and obedience. I'm going to give you some examples. In conformity, participants deny conformity. In obedience, participants tend to embrace obedience as an explanation of their behaviour. Conformity can occur because between people of equal status as well as within a hierarchy, whereas obedience tend to occur within a hierarchy only. Conformity is the emphasis is really on acceptance, whereas in obedience the emphasis is on power. Conformity, the behaviour adopted is similar to that of the group, whereas in obedience the behaviour adopted differs from that of the authority figure. And finally, in conformity, the requirement to yield to group pressure is often, though not always, implicit. However, in obedience, usually it's very explicit. It's very, you should do this, all open about it. He's in charge. He's the big man. And yeah. The main study for obedience is Milgram Study. Again, I'm going to do the same as last time. Aim, procedure, findings, conclusion, evaluation, etc. Start with the aim. To find out if an ordinary Americans would obey an unjust order to inflict pain on another person. Milgram's procedure is basically you got 40 male volunteers were recruited after they responded to a newspaper article asking people to help in a memory experiment. The study took place at Yale University and the experimenter told the participants what the study was on the role of punishment and learning. The participant met Mr. Wallace, who was introduced as another participant. Mr. Wallace was in fact a confederate of the experimenter. Lots were drawn for who should be the learner and who should be the teacher, but the participant was always made to be the teacher. It was kind of fixed. Now the participant watched Mr. Wallace be strapped into a chair in the next room with his arms attached to the electrodes. The participant read out a series of word pairs and then tested Mr. Wallace's memory. Every time the learner made an error, the teacher was instructed to administer an electric shock. The participant was sat in front of a shock generator which had 30 levels. Now the shock levels went up in 15-volt intervals from 15 volts to 450 volts. Now no shocks were actually administered, but the learner was scripted to basically pound loudly on the wall at 300 volts and after 315 volts stop pounding and give no further answers. If the teacher refused to continue, 4 prods were issued. You have no choice, you must go on, etc. So it's sort of it was verbal prods. They didn't literally sit there and poke the participant. Now the experiment continued until the teacher refused to continue or 450 volts had been administered 4 times. Here are the findings. All participants went to at least 300 volts on the shock generator, and 65% of the participants went to the full 450 volts. Now, most participants dissented verbally but continued to obey the researcher, who prodded them to continue giving shocks. Many participants showed signs of extreme anxiety, biting their lips and trembling. 2 had full-on seizures. Now, the conclusion is basically that the study showed the power of a situation over individuals and how, under certain circumstances, people would obey orders even if it meant going against conscience. Milgram concluded that the crimes against humanity were most likely to outcome of situational factors present in the specific situation rather than dispositional factors within sort of participants themselves. Now, there have been many variations of Milgram study. I'm going to mention 3. Firstly, making the learner's plight more obvious. And the findings this time, 62% voice feedback, the learner making more noises, 40% the teacher and the learner in the same room, 30% if the teacher has to force the learner's hand onto the plate and receive the shock. More variations in the subject of reducing the authority of the experimenter. 48% if the change of venue to a seedy office, 21% to researchers' prods continue to come via telephone from another room, and 20% if the experimenter was an ordinary member of the public rather than a white-coated scientist. Some other variations, it was 93% if the teacher had an assistant who throws the switches when asked to by the teacher, and it was 10% if the teacher was given support from 2 other teachers who refused to continue. So some interesting variations in the different percentages, which you should really write down if you want to learn them. I'm not going to lie to you. Okay, some evaluation now, and there's a lot of points. So I've broken them down, and I'm going to start with talking about internal validity. Participants did not really believe that the shocks they were given were real, is one argument that's been made. Milgram's participants were responding to demand characteristics, and there were many clues that the experiment was fake. The experimenter remaining calm even when the learner appeared to have collapsed might have been one hint. Therefore, the study lacked internal validity. Milgram defended this, though, saying that the participants clearly looked stressed on the video and some had seizures, for God's sake. Now, 56% when asked said they believed it was real, and only 2% believed absolutely categorically it was not real. And some did stop before 450 volts as well. And why would they do that if they didn't think it was real? Similar experiments on puppies also showed 75% obeyed to the end, and this looked more realistic. It's very sad. The poor puppies. Poor puppies. External validity now. Milgram study was replicated in other countries with women too, and similar results. It's been replicated all over the world with similar results. However, some argue that this experiment is not ecologically valid, supported basically by Hoffling study into obedience on nurses. In fact, I'm going to tell you Hoffling study. This is sort of all to do with external validity. The aim of this little mini-study is to see if nurses would obey an order from a doctor that breached hospital regulations and was contrary to safe practice. The procedure took place in a real hospital setting, and an unwitting nurse received a phone call from an unknown doctor asking her to administer a mystery drug to a patient. If they obliged, it would be breaking many of the hospital's rules, and 21 out of 22 nurses obeyed until stopped by another nurse who was an accomplice of the researcher. When asked why they had done so, they said that the doctors would be angry if they didn't cooperate. This shows that pressures from authority can lead to breaking of rules, even if it means putting someone's life at risk. Another little mini subsection is Milgram and the Nazi Holocaust. Essentially, Milgram argues that his work can justify the Nazis' actions in the Holocaust. Some researchers argue that Milgram's lack of ecological validity register this claim as complete rubbish. Milgram's participants were told that the shocks weren't harmful. In the Holocaust, the effects clearly were. Milgram's participants experienced distress when harming the learner, and records show that Nazis enjoyed harming the Jews. All arguments, I must point out, and obedience levels dropped in Milgram study when the authority figure was not there. This is not the case in the Holocaust, so you can argue here and there. Last little bit of evaluation. The study, this is actually, I'm going to evaluate Hoffling's study. The problem with Hoffling's study is that it lacked informed consent, and when other nurses were asked, they said that they thought anyone basically would refuse to obey with the order. The experiment was repeated with a no-drug Valium, and the nurses were allowed to confide in other nurses, and only 2 out of the 18 obeyed, showing that Hoffling's study also lacked ecological validity. Okay, on to explanations of obedience. And again, there are 3 explanations, beginning with explanation number 1, which is legitimate authority. We feel obligated to those in power because we respect their credentials and assume they know what they're doing. Legitimate social power is held by those authority figures whose role is defined by society, which usually gives the person the right to exert control over the behaviour of others, and others usually accept it. For example, me right now, you're probably taking my word as this is what you have to learn because I seem to be in some authority position as the person who made this video. I may be talking utter rubbish to you right now, and I've just sown a seed of doubt. I promise you, I'm telling you the truth. On to evidence for legitimate authority. Basically, evidence 4 is Milgram's variations. When they moved the location, it dropped to 48%. When the experimenter was ordinary, it dropped to 20%. When they tried it in Australia, it was 40%, and Germany, 85%. And these countries differ on authority tradition, Australia being less so and Germany more so. So that's kind of evidence for this legitimate authority sort of explanation. Against, though, is personality. Individual differences may affect this, as 35% disobeyed in the original experiment. For example, one said he couldn't continue because he was Jewish, so it's interesting that personality may actually play a role. A second explanation of obedience is graduated commitment. This is the foot in the door effect. People see small steps as harmless, and by the experimenter gradually increasing the stages rather than just having one big stage, people see it as easier to obey. This sucks the participants in, arguably, and Milgram argued that after a point the participants felt contracted to the study, so they had to kind of keep going. Some evidence for this, 4, is that Milgram Study. Basically, that's evidence enough. 15-volt intervals were used, and if they agreed to the last one, they could agree to the next one. So it's kind of the exact thing that I'm talking about. Some more evidence is that in the real world, salesmen use this technique, and it works. Can I come in? Yes, I can. Would you like whatever? I don't know. It's used. Just put the word salesman down in your AO2 and get marks. I don't know. Some evidence against, though, again, is personality. Individual differences may affect this, and it's exactly the same point as I said with the last explanation. The final explanation is the agentic state. Milgram's theory states that people operate on 2 levels, being aware of the consequences of their actions and seeing themselves as agents of others, not actually responsible for their own actions. Milgram argued that participants pass the blame onto the authority figure, and therefore they would accept any instruction the authority figure gave because it would be their fault if something went wrong. It was argued that this feature is taught to children at an early age to train them to be obedient. I don't know, it's all up in the air. That's it for this part. This has been Obedience. This is Social Influence Part 2. Join me next time as I'll be going over ethical issues and some implications and other such things to do with that. Basically finishing off the Social Influence unit. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. If you don't have any questions, then go down to the comments and answer them because you're a very intelligent human being. Also, I forgot to mention last time, have a look in the description for links to some helpful revision packs to go along with these videos because I'm such a lovely human being. Praise and compliments are also welcome. That's it for now. Thank you for listening. I've been Will Carne. This has been Wahey Productions. Goodbye.